General Hospital spoilers tease that Kai's ambitious surgery, once painted as a medical miracle, has officially turned into a disaster. Not only did it fail to help him recover, but it now puts him at risk of being completely paralyzed, a terrible shock not only to his body but also a fatal blow to the spirit and honor of an athlete who once stood at the pinnacle of glory. Doctors began to warn of irreversible spinal cord damage. Signals from his body became chaotic, his nervous system responded slowly, and his ability to move seemed to be cruelly slipping away from him, inch by inch. In a moment when it seemed like there was no hope, Kai began to understand that he was no longer the center of an inspirational story, but a victim in a power game that he didn't realize he had been dragged into. The obsession with being forced into a dangerous surgery, with full warnings from Dr. Portia, was eating away at Kai's mind every day. But the pain lies not only in the failure, but in the fact that he once trusted Drew, the man who stood before him with a determined face and words that sparkled with hope. Drew not only funded the surgery, but also indirectly shaped the way Kai's story was told in the documentary, a production designed to portray a generous, powerful man, rather than reflect the harsh reality Kai lived in. Now, each painful awakening, each sudden seizure, each lingering numbness, provoked a slow but violent change in Kai. What began as frustration turned to hatred. Deep down, he felt betrayed, not just by the medical results, but by the entire media system Drew had created around him, treating him as a symbol to be exploited and then quietly discarded when he was no longer of any use. Kai's ongoing psychological adjustment was not just about how he viewed Drew, but also about his transformation into someone who would fight relentlessly to hold those responsible accountable. And from his hospital bed, Kai began to gather evidence. He reviewed filming contracts, recorded conversations, binding emails, and unaired clips where Drew stood before the camera and said, "I will ensure Kai's safety and future." Those words now cut deep. Kai was no longer a man who would just accept defeat. He began to contact lawyers, send letters asking to renegotiate his sponsorship terms, and even hinted at the possibility of going public with the truth, a strategic retaliation against Drew's reputation. Drew, meanwhile, is still caught up in a series of other crises, from a custody battle with Willow to the public pressure surrounding his past of cheating on Portia and manipulating relationships. But nothing could do more damage to his image than a victim like Kai coming forward to tell the entire Port Charles community that he was made a pawn in a covert PR campaign. Kai knows that, and he won't hesitate. Because now, even though he's in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, Kai has one goal: to force Drew to face the real consequences, not just the legal ones, but the loss of everything he's built through manipulation and lies. Drew's so-called medical miracle has become a new obsession not just for Kai, but for the entire Port Charles community, where people are starting to question whether Drew is really the hero he's been promoting himself as. The madness of a dream built on ambition and fame is now crumbling with every breath, every scream of pain that Kai suppresses at night. And as anger turns to action, as the former victim becomes the leader of the whistleblower, all of Port Charles will witness a legal, media, and moral battle whose consequences will leave lasting scars on all involved. Curtis and Portia are no longer mere bystanders to the demise of a talented athlete, but they have become two core elements in the effort to protect and regain justice for Kai, who is pushed to the edge of despair after a failed surgery. They understand better than anyone that behind the glamour of Kai's career recovery campaign is a series of personal calculations and media manipulations that Drew has created to improve himself in the public eye. But when the real consequences come to Kai, from irreversible physical damage to the risk of permanent paralysis, Curtis and Portia know it is time to act. No longer are they given medical comfort or humanitarian silence, they now choose to stand up, to become the voice on behalf of the forgotten person in their own story. One of the important events taking place is the clear change in the way Curtis and Portia see their role. Curtis, a man who has suffered both physically and mentally, sees himself in Kai's empty eyes. The days Kai endured the pain, the times he silently suppressed his screams when he couldn't move his legs, all of it made Curtis unable to turn away. And Portia, as a doctor who had warned but was not listened to, carried a deep obsession with medical ethics and the duty to protect patients. That obsession is transforming into a determination that she will not let Kai become a number in the statistics of medical failure, or worse. A name forgotten by powerful forces that want to suppress the truth. They begin their journey against the system by thoroughly investigating medical records, tracing back Drew's shady funding, and especially uncovering the entire production process of the documentary that Drew forced Kai to sign a contract for while he was still mentally ill. In the public eye, the film is a symbol of compassion and second chances, but for Kai, who is losing hope, it is just a painted wound. One of the new changes that is taking place is that Curtis and Portia are no longer just talking to lawyers, but also starting to contact the press, human rights activists, and the patient community that has been turned into a media tool. While Kai becomes increasingly desperate, haunted, and angry, Curtis and Portia's actions are the only source of strength that keeps him from completely collapsing. They understand that this is not just a fight for one person, but a wake-up call for a medical and media system that is becoming increasingly cold, calculating, and inhumane. And then, one of the new catastrophic changes is sparked, when Kai, with the legal and moral support of Curtis and Portia, officially files a lawsuit against Drew for exploiting his mental instability to manipulate his medical decisions. This blow not only caused Drew to lose control of his image, but also forced him to face a series of legal and moral consequences, in which the biggest question is not whether he will lose, but how much more he will lose on the way to success through scandal and fake image. One of the biggest changes that is shaking Port Charles is that the community, people who once admired Drew, are now starting to ask questions. They ask why someone like Kai became a victim. They ask why Portia and Curtis, two people who always stayed away from scandal, are willing to bet their careers to stand on the side of someone who seemed hopeless. And they also ask, how many other Kais have silently fallen in the flashy campaigns of those who use the name of charity? Kai, although still lying motionless on his hospital bed, is no longer alone. Behind him is Curtis, behind him is Portia, behind him is a force quietly rising to fight against injustice and manipulation. A new, powerful, and profound assault is brewing. It is not a simple counterattack, but a revolution that will redefine trust, medical ethics, and human dignity. And in that storm, seemingly weak people like Kai can become the leaders. Thanks to allies like Curtis and Portia who never turn their backs. A new obsession is forming, but this time, it will not break a person, but an entire system. The custody trial for Wiley and Amelia, already tense and divisive between Michael, Willow, Drew and the other factions, suddenly became the center of an unprecedented public storm when Curtis and Portia appeared with Kai, who was now a living testament to the consequences of a medical crime that Drew had secretly orchestrated. In the shocking silence of the courtroom, the sight of Kai sitting in a wheelchair, his legs immobile and his face calm but determined, drew all eyes to him like a wordless accusation. Curtis and Portia's personal escort of Kai to court was not only an act of personal support but also a public statement against the manipulative and calculating machine that Drew had built around the failed surgery. Immediately, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. What had been a contentious custody battle became even more complicated when the judge asked to review the evidence that Curtis and Portia had brought with them. Inside the thick file were medical documents, internal emails, meeting minutes, and even audio recordings that showed Drew pushing for experimental surgery on Kai, even though doctors like Portia had warned him of the risk of permanent damage. Each page cut into Drew's moral veneer, tearing down his image as a devoted father and replacing it with a portrait of a man willing to exploit the suffering of others to advance his own. Kai, though barely able to move, managed to keep his voice steady as he recounted his experience to the court. He described in detail how he felt persuaded, coaxed into surgery with the promise that he would return to the field, play, and get his life back. He also recounted the moments of waking up in the hospital, with no feeling in his legs. No family by his side, just a camera recording his every move as if his life were a propaganda tool. Kai's story moved not only the judge but everyone in the courtroom, including Michael and Carly. One of the biggest correctives of the moment was that the court began to consider Drew's ethics and motives not only as a doctor but also as a father. Curtis and Portia didn't stop at providing evidence. They also pointed out the connection between Drew's actions and the psychological impact they had on Willow, a woman who had once placed her trust in Drew but was now beginning to realize the bitter truth. They argued that if Drew could use others for his own purposes as he did with Kai, then his claim to custody might not have been motivated by love but by a desire to control and protect his own image. This is no longer a story of two parents who want the best for their children, but a battle of character, morality, and power masquerading as love. Drew's crimes, carefully hidden in sponsorship deals and media campaigns, are now exposed layer by layer. The promises, the sweet talk, the backroom handshakes are now evidence against him. Drew's situation becomes dire as the judge begins to question his guardianship not only of Wiley and Amelia, but of everything he's built in the community. An internal investigation into the ethical conduct of Drew's medical programs is being proposed. Investors, the media, and even close allies like Carly and Willow are starting to have their doubts. As Kai quietly left the courtroom with Curtis and Portia by his side, the public saw not a failed patient, but a survivor, and a symbol of resistance. Meanwhile, Drew sat silently at the defense table. His eyes glazed over as he realized the massive undercurrent he couldn't control was sweeping over everything he thought he had. And the scariest thing was not that he might lose custody of his son, but that he was losing the trust of everyone who had ever stood by him, because one wrong choice, one person he had overlooked, one surgery he had considered a publicity stunt, had become the most powerful punishment he had ever faced. In this fight, justice was no longer a distant dream, but a hidden truth was being revealed step by step, with Curtis, Portia, and Kai leading the way. Trina and Jocelyn are now more than just loyal friends on the side of justice, they are becoming key allies in the fight to expose the truth about Drew and protect Kai's rights. With the intelligence and tenacity she has shown in the past, Trina enters this fight as an astute observer, and a bridge between Kai and human rights organizations, independent journalism, and civil rights lawyers. Meanwhile, Jocelyn, who is strong-willed and deeply haunted by the betrayal of trust, acts like a smoldering storm, quietly gathering information, leading public opinion, and gradually exposing what Drew has tried to hide behind his charity projects and altruistic reputation. Jocelyn not only sympathizes with Kai's tragic situation, but also senses the danger that lies ahead if the whole truth is not brought to light. She had seen too many innocent people sacrificed to the whims of the powerful, and this time, she would not allow it to happen again. So Jocelyn began using all her resources, from personal connections, to university media, to social media, to shape public opinion. Unearthing buried medical documents and resurrecting Drew's public ethical statements. She exposed contradictions in Drew's words and actions, using clips from the Frozen documentary as evidence that Drew had tried to make Kai a symbol of victory when in fact Kai had suffered a medical tragedy that had never been properly handled. Trina worked behind the scenes, quietly reaching out to law and medical students, expanding her personal investigation to learn more about Drew's surgical procedures and the contracts he had signed with the hospital. What she discovered was more than a single botched surgery. It was a series of systematic mistakes, from falsifying consent forms, forcing patients into unconsciousness-based filming sessions, to covering up the consequences by blocking access to full medical records. Trina began compiling everything, evidence, testimony, records, as if preparing for an independent trial that, if necessary, would bring Drew to justice not only in family court, but also in criminal court if possible. However, Jocelyn and Trina's actions also created a tremendous amount of counterpressure, and things began to spiral out of control. Drew, sensing the growing public pressure, hired additional lawyers, and launched a media blitz, claiming that Kai was the victim of toxic media, that Trina and Jocelyn were being led by emotion instead of facts. But that response only made Jocelyn more determined. She began releasing bits and pieces of the buried documentary, which showed Kai still too weak to sign the contract Drew had forced him to sign. A new media disaster began to explode. Hashtags like #JusticeForKai and #DrewLies began to spread on social media. The pressure extended beyond Drew to his sponsors, causing many organizations to reconsider their cooperation. Trina, though still calm, began to feel it clearly. They were pushing a powerful man to the brink of despair, and if they weren't careful, Drew, in a panic, could react in ways they couldn't have foreseen. Kai, who was at the center of it all, remained silent, not out of weakness but because he understood that those around him were fighting for him. But that silence added weight to every piece of evidence, every story that Jocelyn and Trina presented. In such a fragile moment, one small mistake, one unexpected event, could turn the tide of battle. But these two girls still choose to believe in justice, to believe that the truth will eventually prevail. Even when facing one of Port Charles's most formidable manipulators. And in all of this, the strong bond between Trina, Jocelyn and Kai not only saves a life, but also ushers in a new order, where silence is no longer a tool for concealment, but the beginning of a voice that can shake the entire system. Drew is entering a dark period in his life, where everything he has worked so hard to build, the image of a father figure, successful businessman, humanitarian donor, is being slowly peeled away and distorted by the very choices he thought were safe. The initial cracks in his facade have now widened into deep fissures, as the public, the law, and those close to him who once placed their trust in him turn against him. Drew's every move is no longer the action of a man in control, but the panicked reaction of a man backed into a corner, trying to hold on to the last shred of power in a world that is crumbling around him. What makes the situation so serious is not just that Drew has been exposed as the mastermind behind Kai's botched surgery, but the dire consequences of that surgery, a young man full of ambition, now facing the prospect of permanent paralysis, losing his career, his future, and his ability to be independent. And though Kai never publicly accused Drew, his presence in the wheelchair in the courtroom, his silent glance, was like a stab to the public image Drew was trying to save. It sent Drew into a state of obsession. He couldn't sleep, couldn't step out in public without being tormented by reproachful eyes, couldn't lift his head to look at his own face in the mirror. In that crisis, Drew began to make new calculations, more dangerous, more insane, more reckless. He tried to smear Portia, who had warned him about the risks of the surgery. He had his lawyers dig into Curtis's past, looking for any weakness that could sway public opinion. But the more he did, the more Drew revealed the true nature behind the shiny walls, a manipulator. Someone willing to sacrifice anyone to protect himself. And most frightening of all, Drew may be secretly putting Kai in further danger, as he attempts to compromise, bribe, and even pressure Kai into recanting his testimony or refusing to continue his legal journey. No one knows what cards Drew holds up his sleeve, but sources say he has been documenting Kai's entire recovery journey for use in a documentary. If that footage is edited and manipulated to disprove the accusations and make Kai appear to be a voluntary risk-taker, it will not only threaten Kai's reputation but also the psychological safety and respect he may have maintained after the incident. And if that happens, Drew will no longer be seen as a moral violator, but as someone willing to destroy another person's life again just to protect his own empty shell. Jocelyn, Trina, and Kai's supporters are beginning to realize this new danger. They are gathering evidence, preparing public opinion, and holding unofficial press conferences to counter any media attacks that Drew may come up against. Meanwhile, Willow, who once trusted Drew completely, is starting to feel confused and disoriented. She can't believe that the man who has stood by her side through so much could be part of a medical conspiracy that has robbed a young man of his future. It's sending Willow into a crisis of conscience, and her prolonged silence from the media is a clear sign that her trust in Drew is wavering. Meanwhile, Drew is still trying to fight back, bit by bit. He's ramping up his legal strategy, hiring a new media advisor, and starting public charity events to distract from the public. But deep down, he knows that everything is falling apart. He knows that if Kai continues to stand, if Curtis and Portia don't back down, if Jocelyn releases the never-before-seen videos, everything he's built will crumble to dust. And it's that slow, steady collapse that's terrifying. Drew isn't just being beaten from the outside, he's being eaten away from the inside, by growing obsessions, by deepening isolation, by mounting miscalculations. This fight isn't about custody or reputation, it's about holding on to the last shred of humanity he has left. But will he be able to stop himself before he becomes the person he once condemned? Or will Kai's collapse bring Drew's own irrevocable end, a fate shaped by his own arrogance and blind ambition? Drew, desperate to retain what remains of his power and reputation, is preparing a bold and dangerous counterattack, reporting Kai. With no other choice but to turn the tide of legal and public opinion, Drew decides to go from passive to proactive. To turn the tide and regain control of a narrative that has spiraled out of control. The filings' legal team is quietly preparing allege that Kai deliberately misled doctors and sponsors about his health before his fateful surgery. That he hid an old injury or concealed his past use of performance-enhancing substances, setting the stage for his eventual downfall. Drew doesn't stop at questioning motives, but prepares to present hypothetical evidence that paints Kai not as a victim, but as a dangerous player in this game, who Drew says has exploited his kindness in exchange for fame and media exposure. One of the new obsessions that is beginning to take shape is that Kai, while struggling with the physical and psychological pain of his injuries, now faces an unequal legal battle, one where he faces someone with enough money, influence, and a team of professional advisors to twist the truth to the extreme. Drew's strategic adjustment is not just a response, but also a public declaration of war, that he will not sit idly by and wait for a verdict. And what's more dangerous is that if his accusations are taken seriously by a judge or the public, Kai could find himself in legal jeopardy, facing suspicion, personal tarnishing, and even losing the support of those who once stood by him. People like Jocelyn, Trina, Curtis, and Portia, no matter how determined they are, would have little chance of protecting Kai from the media fallout and legal pressure if Drew were to launch a full-blown counterattack. One of the new changes that's quietly creeping in is that the emotional and moral balance of the narrative is being manipulated by power. Drew knows that in this world, sometimes the priority isn't the truth, but which story is told more forcefully, more organized, and more widely. He's taking full advantage of that. And Kai, now not just a patient, but a media defendant, faces a vicious reckoning. Kai is now thrust into a new danger zone. Not only is he at risk of losing the trust of his community, but he is also at risk of being forced to prove himself in a fight he was never mentally prepared to fight. Drew, with cold determination and terrifying calculation, is proving that he is willing to push any moral boundaries to protect his position, no matter who gets hurt along the way. And without a strong pushback, or a decisive intervention from justice or an honest media, Kai, who once dreamed of a brilliant sporting future, could now be crushed to pieces in the ruthless wheel of fame and betrayal.